I don't really like rhythm games. I mean, you've never even seen me talk about a rhythm game before on the channel, so I think that's kind of a given. Timing is just not my thing. However, there is one rhythm game that I decided to give a shot solely because it was Zelda themed. That's right, I'm talking about the one and only Cadence of Hyrule, which is a bit more substantive than your average rhythm game. This game was done by Brace Yourself Games, the folks responsible for Crypt of the NecroDancer, which is a phenomenal game. And since that game was so great, it's just a crossover of elements from that game that tie into elements from the 2D Zelda game. It came out on the Switch 2 years ago on June 13th, 2019. The creator of Crypt of the NecroDancer, Ryan Clark, returned to direct on this project. It all started when Clark decided he wanted Crypt of the NecroDancer to feature a Legend of Zelda DLC crossover in its Switch version. This practice is nothing new. I mean, Sonic Lost World did it all the way back in 2013. But due to the mutual interest that the project was generating between the two companies, eventually Nintendo made a very bold choice. They would make a crossover game between the two series. I say this is bold because I can't really think of anything like this ever happening. Nintendo is very protective of its intellectual properties, especially after the disaster of the CDI games. So to see them partnering in such a massive way with a small indie company is completely out of left field. But in a good way. I really wish Nintendo was more lenient with stuff like this. So the project was developed as a sequel to Crypt of the NecroDancer and a new Zelda game. Clark was really excited to work on the project because of how prominent music is in the Zelda games. After all, not only are their soundtracks often great, but instruments play an important role in many of their stories. In Ocarina and Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, the baton in the Wind Waker, a harp in Skyward Sword, and so on. All 25 songs were done by composer Danny Baranowski, though most of them are just remixes of classic Zelda songs. Part of the reason the game looks so darn good in terms of pixel art is that the art style was developed by the same team behind Sonic Mania, which throws another cool crossover into the mix. The game was announced at the end of one of those Nintendo Direct Nindies showcases on March 20th, 2019. I distinctly remember watching the announcement and being confused, but excited. Then I never actually ended up getting the game. Oops. So, what's going on in Cadence of Hyrule? Well, a new mysterious villain named Octavo, and yes, I'm pronouncing it that way because it's pronounced octave, has used the Triforce of Power to turn his lute into a golden lute and put the King of Hyrule, Zelda, and Link all to sleep. Cadence, from Crypt of the NecroDancer, shows up and wakes all of them up, and while she goes to try and get home, Link and Zelda go to fight Octavo's 4 champions. Each of these champions have enchanted instruments with magic powers, which is a really neat theming for a villain group. They're also named after classic Zelda bosses, such as Glockenspiel, the 4-headed dragon with a Glockenspiel, being named for Gleeok, the multi-headed dragon from the first Zelda game. I love villain groups with connective themes like that, but that's a story for another day. After Link, Zelda, and Cadence, who rejoins them eventually, go into Hyrule Castle using the mystical instruments, Octavo reveals that he and his 4 champions were the ones who were supposed to defeat Ganon. Honestly, I think this is an incredibly fun twist. The villain you were working against the whole game was, in some capacity, keeping a greater evil at bay. Ganon is going to take over Hyrule in the future, so Octavo sends you to the future and the 3 main characters have to fight him off. I'm not a fan of this part. I don't see why there had to be a fight with Ganon. Ganon can play a role in the plot without needing to be the final boss, and I really don't like this series' strong adherence to making him the final boss all the time. After this, Link and Zelda send Cadence back to her own world using the Triforce. It's a simple plot, but it didn't have to be spectacularly important or anything. Some of the best melodies are the simplest. But how about that gameplay, huh? Well, to fully understand the gameplay of Cadence of Hyrule, one has to look to the game that it was directly inspired by, Crypt of the NecroDancer, of course. There are many similarities and many differences that can only really be understood by having played both of them. So, Crypt of the NecroDancer itself is also a top-down game, though it's more roguelike, where you explore sections of a procedurally generated dungeon as one of many playable characters, the main one being Cadence, of course. This is pretty standard for roguelikes. Something especially fun about Crypt of the NecroDancer are the various ways the player can play the game. You can use a controller, your keyboard, or a dance pad, like from Dance Dance Revolution. I just find the concept of controlling a PC game with a DDR dance pad to be very funny. Of course, in Cadence of Hyrule, this one is not carried over for obvious reasons, but isn't it nice to imagine? The game has a really interesting way of moving. Instead of typical top-down free movement, you can only move on a grid in certain ways with the beat of the music, and you can only attack with the beat of the music as well. This leads to me not being very good at the game, but the concept is genius and I think it's worked in very well. If you don't match the beat, then a coin multiplier built up by successful beat matches will reset, which I think is a good penalty, as opposed to like dying or something, which is something only the enemies can inflict on you. It'd really suck to die if you missed a beat. Now, despite the inherently randomized nature of a roguelike, each enemy has patterns to memorize, which I really like. The idea that you can memorize a certain aspect of a roguelike in order to take advantage of it is always neat. Binding of Isaac also does this particularly well with its boss fights. As with most roguelikes, exploring gets you more items, weapons, and armor, and your inventory is automatically managed by the game, which is a feature that I especially appreciate. Maintaining a tidy inventory can often be a pain in the butt. I'm looking at you, mother. Of course, there's also those coins I mentioned earlier, which let you buy things from shopkeepers. I've never understood the purpose of shops in roguelikes, to be honest. I often feel like they're only there because most roguelikes have shops in them. They aren't a very interesting way to interact with the world. You just buy items from them. You don't really get anything useful most of the time. And especially in the context of Crypt of the NecroDancer, which takes place in a literal crypt, they often don't make much sense within the world's context. The more permanent currency that doesn't disappear upon death are diamonds, which are used to permanently upgrade your character in the game's main lobby. I love this compromise many roguelikes have. There is still a permanent progression for your character, though I must admit it takes away from the overall artistic vision of the roguelike. I mean, if you can make progress, then doesn't that kind of ruin having to reset from the beginning every time you go into the dungeon? Maybe I'm vastly misreading the intent of most roguelikes when I say that, though. The dungeon itself consists of 4 zones with 3 levels each, making this game refreshingly short. The first 3 require you to find the exit and defeat a mini-boss, while the 4th always has a boss fight. Also, in a particularly genius twist, if you don't finish a level in the same time frame as the song that plays during it, you automatically skip to the next level and lose all possible rewards. This actually creates a lot more choice in the player than most roguelikes, and I heavily appreciate it. Should you explore for everything, or go to the next floor and avoid losing it all? Getting everything in an area is often the undisputable optimal path in a roguelike, and a game that has actual consequences for trying to do that is pretty cool. You access zones from the aforementioned lobby, it's like so many video game lobbies, Purgatory. You can also access a special mode upon completing the game here called All Zones mode, which is all the zones in the game in order that you have to complete without dying in one run. This is really fun. It's a great way to test your skills and memorization of the rhythmic patterns throughout the game, and I think it's the optimal way to play once you feel as if you've mastered the game. As you go through the game, you unlock more characters aside from Cadence that each have their own gameplay mechanics that interact with the world in different ways. A particular favorite of mine is the monk, who has access to a free item in every shop. Seems useful, right? Well, if he touches gold, he just fucking dies. That's just too good. There's also the coolest way of displaying the player's progression in any game. As you progress through the crypt, you recruit more and more people to the lobby that provide different services to the player. I love this in all the games it's in. There's no feeling like growing your own home over the course of an adventure. These NPCs will let you train with them to help perfect your tactics against certain bosses, or some of them will become permanent shopkeepers who sell you items for diamonds. Something really interesting about this game's soundtrack is that as you delve further and further into the dungeon, the songs increase in tempo. This is a really cool way to escalate the difficulty in a natural way, as not only are you getting closer and closer to your goal, but you're also hearing the music itself crescendo. I mean, you could set custom music instead, but why the hell would you do that, you monster? I guess it's nice to have the option, but the game was designed with a certain kind of progression in mind musically, and I don't want to break that. Now, how does Cadence of Hyrule take all this and build upon it? Well, for starters, it doesn't. It throws out a lot of the most interesting stuff, sadly. To begin, one downgrade from Crypt of the NecroDancer is that there are less playable characters, at least when the game was first released. Only 4 characters are present in the base: Link, Zelda, Cadence, and Yves, the Deku Scrub that wants to be a hero, who is a secret character. Yves is pretty awesome and really cute. I mean, he has no arms, so he can't use most of the game's items, but it's still disappointing that there are less ways to go through the game than in Crypt of the NecroDancer. This was remedied somewhat after the game came out, but I'm still not a fan of DLC fixing issues with the base game. There is also an overworld now, which causes a huge slew of new problems. Due to the fact that there's an overworld, the songs have to loop, and no longer are you forced to progress to the next floor if a song ends, which was one of the most interesting mechanics of the original game. Also, due to the consistent overworld, you can no longer build up a home base, which is a really disappointing omission. How cool would it have been for the game to let you build up a base full of iconic Zelda characters from across the franchise? You could have had the Carpenters from Ocarina of Time show up and build houses for people. It could have been a little bit like Minish Cap's side quest where you build a house for Din, Nehru, and Farroor. Instead, you're stuck with the same people for the whole game. I do like that the layout of the overworld map is procedurally generated though, even if the locations such as Death Mountain or Hyrule Castle will always appear in it. Dungeons themselves are randomly generated, which is great. Another major gripe I have with the game is that you don't have to move in time with the music all the time. You only have to move in time with the music when the enemies are on screen. This leads to a very jarring shift in gameplay from screen to screen. I would have preferred if enemies were simply on every screen or something. Also, most of the roguelike elements have been removed. There are just a few temporary items like shovels and torches, but otherwise you keep everything when you die. Well, besides the rupees you accumulate, those go away when you die. You can also activate Sheikah Stones in several areas which you can fast travel to after you die, which further removes the weight of death. Side note, I do like that the Sheikah Stones look like jukeboxes. That's very cute. There are two optional modes, Fixed Beat Mode, which makes it so you don't have to play in time to the music, and Permadeath Mode, which is exactly what it sounds like. Personally, I think playing in Permadeath Mode is the way you should go if you want to experience this game properly, because it's the way to play the game with the most engaging stakes involved. Part of the appeal of roguelikes is that death will set you back significantly, and this just isn't present in this game otherwise. Fixed Beat Mode, while I appreciate as an accessibility feature, I can't appreciate from a design perspective. It's just literally removing the core mechanic of the game. That's all I really have to say about that. There's also 2-player, but you have to use 2 individual Joy-Con controllers, which sounds like hell. Despite all my complaining, the soundtrack does not disappoint. Maybe it's just my Eurotrash loving father speaking vicariously through me, but I love it. Even though most of this game's fan service is for the 2D Zelda games and I've always preferred the 3D outings, I can't deny that a lot of the songs it chooses from those 2D Zelda games are definitive bangers. I vastly appreciate the overworld rendition being based on Tall Tall Heights from Link's Awakening, which is my personal favorite version of the main theme of the Zelda series. I don't understand why the title screen theme is a remix of the Ocarina of Time title theme though, considering that again, this is heavily based on Zelda's 2D entries more than anything in the 3D games. After the game's release, some DLC was added to the game on December 18th, 2019, the day before my birthday. This adds a few things, namely a challenging enemy rush mode called Dungeon Mode, which is essentially a hard mode for the game that makes you just go through all the dungeons. This, combined with permadeath, I think is the ideal way to play the game. It's similar to Crypt of the NecroDancer's own Zone Rush mode. It's a great way to re-experience the game and test your skills, while also having the grueling stakes that most roguelike players are looking for. This DLC also added Octavo as a playable character, and playing as the villain is always a cool feature regardless of game. Then later in July 2020, even more DLC was announced, though this wasn't free DLC, you had to pay for it. The first added 5 more playable characters: Araya, Cadence's grandma from Crypt of the NecroDancer, who's fun to play as here, Frederick, who is also in Crypt of the NecroDancer, Impa, who's pretty much always awesome, and Shadow Link and Shadow Zelda, who are fine, I guess. I suppose it's better to have the option to play as them than not, but man, it's lame that there are just clones of Link and Zelda here. The second DLC pack, released on August 31st, 2020, added some more music remixed by Family Jewels, A Rival, and Chipcell, who are all pretty notable fan musicians. I like Family Jewels' music, but the game wasn't really designed with any of these songs in mind, so I prefer to play it with the original soundtrack. Again, it's nice to have options. The final DLC, Symphony of the Mask, came out on September 23rd, 2020, and added a whole new storyline surrounding Skull Kid. And I really love this, just because I really love Skull Kid. It hit me right in the weak part of me. You got me, guys. A month later, a physical version of the game with all DLC came out, just in case you're one of those collecting types. I personally try to avoid getting physical releases, but I don't think that it's bad if you're into that. It can be nice to have a shelved version of a game. Overall, Cadence of Hyrule is an interesting experiment. On one hand, I love the new soundtrack and the sprite art. The gameplay systems are an interesting take on the Zelda formula, and the plot has a fun spin on tired Zelda tropes. Also, playing as Skull Kid always makes my heart happy. But on the other hand, after playing Crypt of the NecroDancer, it's hard not to see a ton of missed potential. Crypt of the NecroDancer has far more characters and far more interesting gameplay mechanics to expand on its premise more, and I think a more straight conversion of its gameplay to Zelda might have given the Zelda series some unique life. Instead, this game feels like it focuses more on the Zelda side of things than the NecroDancer side of things, and that really hurts it. I really hope that Nintendo eventually revisits this title and we see more attempts at refining this formula. But we're never going to see that, so this has been Arcade Everlasting, who has to keep in time with the rhythm or else I'll die, signing off. Thank you for watching.